They told you it was a place of healing. A sanctuary for the broken. But what if it was a cage? What if the stone walls and locked gates weren't there to keep the world out, but to keep a secret in? The St. Jude Asylum. A name that now feels like a hollowed-out prayer. In the winter of 1908, 67 patients were admitted. Their files, neatly archived and stamped with official seals, speak of hysteria, melancholia, and nervous disorders. A textbook tragedy. But there's a missing page in that textbook, a chapter they ripped out and burned. The truth is, not a single one of those 67 souls ever left the grounds. Not in an ambulance. Not in a carriage. Not even in a coffin delivered to a grieving family. They simply vanished. The official story is a well-worn lie, polished over decades until it shines like truth. But beneath that shine lies a grim, silent conspiracy. This isn't a ghost story. It's a story about power. About control. It's about what happens when institutions are given absolute authority over human life. Forget the whispers you've heard. We're going to open the file that was never meant to be opened. We're going to walk the halls of St. Jude and uncover the forbidden history of the 67. The St. Jude Asylum was a marvel of its time. A grand Victorian structure, financed by the era's industrial titans, built in a secluded, forested valley. It was positioned as the pinnacle of psychiatric care, a beacon of hope for families grappling with the mental illnesses that were so poorly understood. But there were signs, right from the beginning, that something was profoundly wrong. The architecture itself was a contradiction, beautiful on the outside, but inside, a labyrinth of interconnected wings and sealed-off sections. The layout was not designed for therapeutic movement but for a kind of methodical isolation. The staff, hired with unprecedented speed and secrecy, were a curious mix of young doctors with radical, unproven theories, and older orderlies with military backgrounds. Their files, which I have seen, reveal a collective history of unquestioning obedience. This was not a group of caretakers, it was a carefully assembled cadre of enforcers. They were handpicked not for their compassion, but for their ability to follow orders without question. And the man who led them, Dr. Alistair Finch? He was a visionary, they said. But the kind of vision he had was not for healing. It was for control. The patient records themselves are a chilling document. They tell a story not of care, but of a systematic deconstruction of the human mind. The 67 were not chosen at random. They were carefully selected from the social margins, the poor, the unwanted, the politically inconvenient. Their families were either too desperate, too complicit, or too powerless to question the asylum's methods. The intake files contain detailed psychological profiles that go far beyond standard medical practice. They analyze weaknesses, fears, and vulnerabilities with a surgical precision. This wasn't about diagnosis, it was about identifying pressure points. They catalogued their patients not as people, but as subjects. The treatments were equally disturbing. Patients were subjected to sensory deprivation, prolonged isolation, and experimental psychoactive drugs. The goal wasn't to alleviate suffering, it was to erase the self. They weren't trying to fix the patients, they were trying to break them. Each of the 67 was an experiment in psychological control, designed to see just how far the human mind could be pushed before it shattered completely. The asylum's funding was a complex web of corporate donations and private trusts. On the surface, it appeared to be an act of philanthropy, but a deeper look reveals a different story. The money wasn't coming from a place of compassion, it was flowing from the coffers of powerful industrial families and political interests. These were the same forces that were shaping society, controlling commerce, and influencing public policy. Why would they invest so heavily in a remote, little-known asylum? Because St. Jude wasn't just a mental institution, it was a proving ground. It was a place to test and refine techniques of mind control and institutional dominance. The patients were the raw material. The treatments were the process. And the product? A perfect system of manipulation, a blueprint for psychological subjugation that could be applied on a much larger scale. The asylum was a model for a future where dissent could be pathologized and inconvenient truths could be classified as delusions. This was the hidden agenda, the true purpose behind the gates of St. Jude. The physical structure of St. Jude was a vital part of its psychological control system. It was designed to disorient and disempower. The endless corridors, the identical rooms, the confusing layout, all worked together to erode a patient's sense of place and time. They were kept in a constant state of mild confusion, making them more pliable and susceptible to suggestion. The staff-to-patient ratio was abnormally high, with each patient constantly observed and monitored. There was no privacy, no personal space, and no escape from the watchful eyes of the institution. This constant surveillance created a state of learned helplessness, a condition where the patients eventually stopped trying to resist, stopped trying to think for themselves. It was a psychological cage, built not of bars and locks, but of constant scrutiny and overwhelming authority. The asylum was a total institution, a self-contained world where the rules of the outside world no longer applied. Inside St. Jude, the staff were not just caregivers, they were the absolute arbiters of reality. The official records list Dr. Alistair Finch as a brilliant but eccentric physician. His journals, which were recovered in a sealed vault years later, reveal a much darker reality. Finch saw the human mind not as something to be healed, but as a system to be hacked. He believed that sanity was a construct, a fragile edifice built on social conditioning and institutional rules. And he was determined to prove it. He documented his experiments with a chilling detachment, referring to patients by numbers rather than names. He meticulously recorded their descent into madness, their breakdown of language, their loss of identity. He was less a doctor and more an engineer of the soul, and his lab was the asylum itself. The journals contain diagrams of the mind's architecture, flowcharts of its weaknesses, and schematics for how to exploit them. Finch was not trying to cure mental illness, he was trying to create it. He saw the 67 as a blank slate, and he was determined to write his own terrifying version of reality onto their minds. The local community in the surrounding area was complicit in the silence. The asylum was a source of jobs and local pride, a symbol of progress and philanthropy. The staff were members of the community, their families attended the same churches and shopped at the same stores. They spoke of the asylum with a kind of hushed reverence, a polite respect that masked a deeper unease. But they also knew that no patients ever left. They saw the supply wagons go in and the laundry carts come out. They heard the faint screams on the wind on a particularly still night. But they chose to look the other way. They suppressed their own doubts, convincing themselves that it was for the greater good, that the people inside were too far gone to ever be saved. The institutional manipulation worked on them too, creating a collective denial, a shared fiction that allowed the darkness to fester unchecked. The asylum's power extended far beyond its walls. It controlled the narrative, silencing anyone who dared to question its benevolence. The disappearance of 67 people should have been a national scandal. But it wasn't. The official explanation was a relocation to a new, state-of-the-art facility in a distant city, an account that was dutifully reported by the local newspapers and promptly forgotten. But no such facility ever existed. The patient files, once meticulously organized, ended abruptly. The names of the 67 were simply erased from the public record, their lives reduced to a footnote in a fake press release. The truth was deliberately and systematically suppressed. This was not a coincidence. It was a cover-up. It required the cooperation of local authorities, the complicity of the media, and the unquestioning obedience of the staff. The same power structures that funded the asylum were the ones that ensured its secrets stayed buried. The 67 were not just lost, they were deleted from history, their memory scrubbed from existence to protect a much darker truth. The true fate of the 67 is the heart of this forbidden history. They were not relocated. They were not released. They were used. The asylum was built on a network of underground tunnels and hidden chambers, a secret world beneath the surface of the grand Victorian facade. It was here, in the cold, unlit depths, that the final phase of their treatment was conducted. The patients were subjected to extreme sensory deprivation, forced to live in absolute darkness and silence for extended periods. This was the final act of psychological deconstruction, a process designed to strip them of their core identity. When they emerged, they were no longer the people they had been. They were something else. They were a blank canvas, ready to be written upon, a tool to be used for a purpose we can only begin to comprehend. They had lost their sanity, their memories, and their very selves. They had, in a sense, been erased. Ancient corruption often finds its way into modern institutions. The industrial titans who funded St. Jude were not just captains of industry, they were the heirs to ancient lineages of power and influence. Families who understood that true control is not about force, but about the control of information and the manipulation of the mind. The asylum was an experiment in this ancient form of power. Dr. Finch's methods, while seemingly modern and scientific, were rooted in old, esoteric practices of psychological dominance. He was not just a doctor, he was a gatekeeper of forbidden knowledge, a servant to a power structure that saw human beings as little more than resources to be managed and controlled. The 67 were a sacrifice to this ancient corruption, their minds and souls offered up to a power that seeks to dominate all things. The asylum was a modern crucible for an ancient evil. The institutional manipulation was so effective because it was built on a foundation of genuine human fear and vulnerability. The families of the 67, desperate for a cure, were willing to believe in the promise of St. Jude. They were told that their loved ones would be healed, that they would return to them whole. But this was the ultimate lie, the cruelest deception. The asylum preyed on their hope, using it as a weapon to ensure their compliance. And when the patients disappeared, the families, exhausted and ashamed, were too broken to fight back. The institution had already won. It had taken their loved ones, stolen their hope, and replaced it with a quiet, suffocating guilt. St. Jude was a masterclass in exploiting the human heart, a machine that turned hope into despair and love into a tool of control. The official closure of St. Jude Asylum was a quiet affair. A press release cited financial difficulties and the relocation of its patients. The building was boarded up, the grounds left to decay. But the silence that descended upon the asylum was not the silence of a place abandoned. It was the silence of a place that was still very much in use. The underground tunnels and hidden chambers remained active, a secret heart beating beneath the surface. The disappearance of the 67 had been a test, a proof of concept. The institutional memory was not lost, it was preserved in the dark, hidden archives of the asylum's patrons. The knowledge gained from the 67 was not forgotten, it was refined, codified, and prepared for a new phase of institutional manipulation. The asylum story was not over, it had simply gone underground, waiting for the right time to re-emerge. The long-term effects of this hidden history are all around us. The 67 were the first, but they were not the last. The techniques refined at St. Jude have been applied in countless other institutions, in countless other ways. They are in the way we are conditioned to think, the way we are taught to obey, the way we are manipulated by the constant barrage of information. The seeds of psychological control, first planted in the minds of the 67, have since grown into an immense and sprawling system of social engineering. We are all living in the shadow of that asylum, our minds quietly and methodically shaped by the same principles of dominance and control. The 67 were just the first step in a much larger project. Their story is not a historical curiosity, it is the origin story of our own psychological cage. The suppressed truths of St. Jude are still out there, buried in forgotten records and whispered in hushed tones. The journals of Dr. Finch, the architectural plans for the underground tunnels, the hidden financial ledgers of the asylum's patrons, these documents still exist, hidden in private archives and sealed government vaults. They are the artifacts of a forgotten war, a war for the control of the human mind. The 67 were the casualties of this war, their memories and identities destroyed. But their story, once uncovered, is a powerful weapon. It is a key that can unlock the psychological cage, a truth that can expose the institutional manipulation that we are all subjected to. This is why their story was so carefully suppressed, why their existence was so methodically erased. The truth is dangerous. And the truth about St. Jude is the most dangerous of all. We are now at the point of no return. You have seen the truth, glimpsed the darkness behind the benevolent facade. This knowledge is a weight, a burden, but it is also a key to your own self-mastery. This is the moment your identity shifts, your perception changes forever. To lock in this transformation, to declare your commitment to a world of truth beyond the illusion, I ask you to perform a symbolic act. In the comments section below, write the phrase, "The walls fall," exactly twice. This will be your silent oath, your acknowledgement of the truth that has just been revealed. Do this now. The true purpose of the 67, as revealed in Dr. Finch's journals, was not just to test psychological control, but to create a new kind of human being. A perfect subject. An individual who could be programmed to serve a purpose without question, without doubt, without a trace of their former self. The patients were not being treated, they were being repurposed. Finch's diagrams and notes speak of a process he called cognitive repatterning, a method of erasing old memories and installing new ones. The goal was to create a human tool, a perfect instrument of a hidden power. The 67 were the prototypes for this project, the first in a long line of individuals whose minds would be remade to serve a new master. The asylum was a factory, and the product was control. The physical fate of the 67 remains a mystery, but the psychological remnants of their suffering linger. In the underground tunnels, hidden from the light, were the final stages of the repatterning process. It was here, in the complete sensory deprivation, that their minds were broken and then rebuilt. The staff were trained not to think of them as people, but as projects. The process was brutal, a complete and utter violation of the human spirit. The 67 were not just patients, they were test subjects in a macabre experiment, and their bodies were a disposable side effect. Their minds, however, were considered a valuable asset. The asylum was a machine that consumed souls and produced obedience. The concept of a total institution is central to understanding the true nature of St. Jude. Irving Goffman, a sociologist, would later coin this term, but Finch was a pioneer of the concept. The asylum was a world unto itself, a self-contained ecosystem where the normal rules of society were suspended. The patients were stripped of their personal identities, their clothes, their possessions, and their names. They were forced to conform to a rigid institutional schedule, their every waking moment dictated by the staff. This process of total control was not a flaw in the system, it was the entire point. It was designed to completely isolate the individual and make them utterly dependent on the institution for their every need, both physical and psychological. The mythic undertones of St. Jude are not a coincidence. The asylum's name, St. Jude, is the patron saint of lost causes and desperate situations. This was a deliberate choice, a cruel joke. The founders of the asylum understood the power of symbolism, the way it can be used to cloak a dark reality in a veil of righteousness. They wanted people to believe that the asylum was a place of last resort, a place where miracles could happen. But the only miracles that happened at St. Jude were the miracles of control, the miracles of erasure. The asylum was a sacred space, but it was a sacred space to a very different kind of power. It was a temple to a hidden agenda, and the 67 were its unwilling acolytes. The psychological manipulation techniques used at St. Jude are still in use today. Think about the way information is curated for you, the way narratives are constructed, the way dissent is framed as a mental defect or a form of social deviance. These are the modern-day descendants of Finch's work. The principles of sensory overload and information control are now applied on a global scale. The goal is the same, to erode your ability to think critically, to question authority, to trust your own instincts. The 67 were a cautionary tale, a brutal proof of concept. Their suffering was the foundation upon which a modern system of psychological control was built. The final act of the St. Jude saga was the destruction of the building itself. A fire, they said. A tragic accident. But the fire was not an accident, it was an exorcism. The asylum was no longer needed. The lessons had been learned. The research had been codified. The physical structure was a liability, a place where a curious mind could stumble upon a forbidden truth. So they burned it to the ground, erasing the last vestiges of its existence. But they did not destroy the truth. The truth, like a ghost, lingered in the ashes, in the silent memories of a few select people, and in the forgotten documents of the asylum's past. The institutional manipulation was so complete that the families of the 67 eventually came to believe the official story. They were told that their loved ones had found peace, that they were now in a better place. The grief was real, but it was a manufactured grief, a grief that was carefully shaped and controlled by the institution. They were given a false sense of closure, a comfortable lie that allowed them to move on without ever questioning what had truly happened. The asylum not only controlled the minds of its patients, it controlled the emotions of its victims. It was a machine that could not only erase a person, but could erase their very memory from the world. The existence of a powerful, ancient corruption is not a myth, it is a historical reality. These hidden agendas operate outside of our comprehension, their influence woven into the very fabric of our society. The families that funded St. Jude were a part of this corruption, a network of powerful individuals who saw the asylum as an opportunity to perfect their tools of control. They did not care about the 67, they only cared about the data. The asylum was a step in a much longer game, a game that has been played for centuries, a game that seeks to turn all of humanity into a controlled and obedient flock. The 67 were a sacrifice. A warning. Their story, once revealed, is a mirror, a reflection of the darkness that exists within our own institutions, our own society. It forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. Who are the keepers of our institutions? What are their true motives? What lies are we taught to believe, and what truths are we forbidden to see? The asylum was a microcosm of a much larger world, a world where the powerful seek to control the weak, where the forbidden is kept hidden, and where the truth is the most dangerous thing of all. The 67 were the casualties of this war. And their legacy is a challenge. You have now heard the story of the St. Jude Asylum. You have walked its forbidden halls, peered into its dark secrets, and faced the terrifying reality of its institutional manipulation. This knowledge is not a passive thing, it is a fire. It will burn away the lies, expose the hidden agendas, and awaken you to the world as it truly is. The 67 may have been buried alone, but their story is a testament to the enduring power of truth. Their silence is now your voice. Their forgotten history is now your master key. The world you once knew is gone. And a new world, a world of truth and power, awaits. Now you know. And you will never be the same again.